Did it give, does it? Okay, now I see, okay.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarita Bashalieva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким поклоном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anar. Everyone, welcome to M.Ukraine weekly discussion. This is 117th week of our meetings, and we are very honored to welcome Anastasiia Lutsenko, who joined us from Germany. She is originally from Ukraine, and she will talk on Ukrainian academic life during the war. I will ask Ms. Lutsenko to tell more about herself, but we know she is a scientific coordinator at the academic university, at the Kyiv Academic University of National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and she, as I said, is currently joining us from Germany, where she is affiliated with Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition. Please, Anastasia, your microphone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I think before I start, just the first housekeeping part, so you can see my slides and you can hear me well, right? So I can proceed.
Everything is fine.
Absolutely. Okay, wonderful. Yes. So thank you very much, Victor, for inviting me, and thank you so much for introducing me as well. Just a few words, maybe a bit of disclaimer. I'm not a scientific coordinator of the Kyiv Academic University because it's just too much, and I'm not sure if I'm at that level when I can take that much of responsibility, but I'm a scientific coordinator of the Academcity project, and this is the project that we have developed since very scratch in 2017. This is when we started, and we basically try to develop a scientific park on the premises of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Of course, we're not reforming or trying to do various things that are not welcomed by the institutes, but we're trying to create this area where there can be positive example of technology transfer. So when certain research is actually transferred to the market. So we're trying to organize this ecosystem around the existing institutes of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And we work with this part, which is M.Sc. So we'll work with the institutes from there, but not limited, of course, to that geographical territory. And I would like to start with actually mentioning a few words about myself in general. So I originally come from Ukraine, yes, and I actually, Victor has mentioned that, but I took this out, but I would like to reiterate that I come from Crimea. And why this is important because many Ukrainian families, they experience many relocations due to being neighbors with former Soviet Union, and currently is because of the Russian Federation. So I originally come from the west of Ukraine, but when my grandparents come from the west of Ukraine, but we had to relocate many times because of famine and because of the war and so on and so on. So it's a long story, and I ended up being born in Crimea. But this is just a bit of a background of a personal, because I would like to have this presentation not very technical and not very oriented towards graphs and tables and regressions and so on. I would rather talk about like life of researchers in Ukraine, what we experience, what we see, and who we are as humans in this specific devastating period of our history. And my presentation is called Resilience of Science Systems and Evidence from Ukraine. And I will talk about that briefly because this is what I'm studying, but I would like to draw your attention to the humans who are behind that, because it's fascinating to look at different graphs, and we have interesting graphs to share. But today I would like to talk about people. And why I have this picture here, just to bring a bit more attention to this personal aspect. I think many of you, if not most of you, have seen this picture. This is from Irpin. This is from the first weeks of the war, of the full-scale invasion phase. And these are people evacuating from Irpin over the bridge that has been exploded on purpose, so the Russian forces are actually not entering Kiev from the west, from the northwest. And this is the bridge, which is also the one which I was using often to go there, because I was just about to move to Irpin and to live there. And I know exactly every pit and fall on this bridge, and this is very familiar setting to me. And the buildings at the background are the ones where I was planning to get my apartment. And why I'm saying this is because I didn't move there because we had a final preparation on the weekend before the war has started, and I was fortunate enough not to move in just 4 days before the war started. So it's just that close, and I eventually had to flee, and right now I'm in Munich. And right now I'm trying to work more on understanding what science goes through. And just as a bit of a disclaimer before we move on, so in this short presentation, short in terms of numbers of slides, we can talk as many, as long as we would like to. I'm happy to talk as much as there is interest in this discussion. And there are 3 projects that I would like to share information about. So it's UA Science Reload. Many of you might have seen our research on the needs of Ukrainian researchers during the war, which we have conducted in the very beginning of the war. And it's published, this third link is SSRN. We have published our working paper with them at the moment. And we have conducted 3 waves of surveys, 3 parts, not waves, 3 parts of surveys over different periods of time. And it is definitely something to read, because we spoke to approximately 2,000 researchers during each phase. And then there is also this large project called Science at Risk. And we have collaborated with, I think we were over 30 researchers at that point in time. And we wrote 9 white papers on the problems in Ukraine. This project is supported by the Alfred Sloan Foundation, by the Ministry of Education and Science, by the Embassy of the United States in Ukraine, so by many large organizations. And it's crucial and important what this initiative does. And today I will talk about different bits of information from these research. So these links, they include information on the authors, on the teams, so no one's left out. But today I would like to just to blend this information to provide a bit more evidence on this personal perspective. And so to begin with, just a few words about what I'm doing, just for the sake of maybe networking and so on. So my interest is the state science systems and how do they react to different types of shocks. And for obvious reasons, we talk about state systems as those key elements in the regional development, because if there is no science, there is no proper development in the region or in a given territory. And of course, it's important to mention that every science system has its cycles and has its crises, and how the system overcomes the crises. This is what we study with the team with whom I work, and this is of particular interest to myself. So just to bring a bit of context, if the building where you're sitting right now, if it gets bombed, it's it eventually can be destroyed, right? And how fast do you get back on track? So this specific question, this is what I'm trying to answer, using more the perspective of decision making. And therefore, the presentation that I'm sharing today is more from this perspective. So what do people say? How do people react? How does the system react overall? Because it consists of humans. And one of the research questions that I'm answering is, how do we better characterize resilience of innovation systems or science and innovation systems? Basically, if whatever institution gets destroyed, or if the researchers die, or if they get mobilized, or whatever happens in the system, or there is a new legislative act, how do we respond to that? What actions do we take to tackle the problem? So, and of course, I'm targeting Ukrainian case because of the data accessibility and also understanding of the context, and also a personal interest for many reasons. And just to give a bit of understanding what the resilience is, so we then the entire presentation will be possibly a bit more clear. So when we talk about resilience, obviously it comes from psychology and psychiatry, but and from personal perspective, because this is where everything starts. But then we also talk about physics, we talk about ecology, we talk about various disciplines, sociology, and usually it is about bouncing back or about bouncing forward. So when we see the system, that whatever, we can illustrate it with a ball which gets squeezed and how fast it gets back to its form. And if this ball, for example, is jumping, how fast does it get back to its trajectory, not losing, for example. Well, with the ball, it's not the best example, but it should be not changing the trajectory, and it should be keep moving. So, for example, let's get away from the ball. So if we talk about the research institute, it needs to continue working, and it needs to continue working on the topics that are of key importance to this institute. So if this institute has been disrupted for whatever reason by acute shock or by long-lasting slow burn shock, they're called, like constant bombardments. This is what we have in Ukraine as an example. If this institute gets disrupted and ends up being reformed, cancelled, or becomes another institution, this is obviously something that we can say, well, at least in this period of time, this institute is not resilient enough to withstand this shock. But if this institute, for example, gets enough new funding or new collaborations, new networks, new research topics, and a lot of support, then we can say, okay, not only it is resilient, but it's also able and capable of actually bouncing forward. So, and this is what I'm trying to focus on and to understand how this functions during the war, because even though the funding in Ukraine has decreased substantially when we talk about science, but at the same time, the science is happening and the funding is coming, and the research topics are there, and the international community is interested in supporting Ukrainian science as much as possible. Of course, if we talk about the number of researchers per million, Ukraine has the lowest number, being the country which has inherited over 180,000 researchers in the 90s from the Soviet times, because we know that Ukraine had 3 major research centers of the Soviet Union. Right now we have over 60,000 researchers, and those include the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine and those who work at the for the universities, so not full-time researchers. So the change is drastic. The funding has been decreasing over years, but at the same time, we're in a devastating situation right now in Ukraine, but at the same time, we are able to continue working, at least without major changes in our topics. However, again, it's a question for a separate presentation to explain all the difficulties and problems we have. But just in general, just to give you a bit of overview. So this is the information from the Ukr-NT. Those who are in Ukraine, everyone knows Ukr-NT. This is where we get, where we submit all our R&D reports and dissertations. in terms of information about them, and this is where it's all stored, including the bibliographical information and also the archival, like the reports themselves. And this is where the information about the number of dissertations and R&D reports over years is collected so thoroughly that we can trace that basically day by day. And it's one of those sources of information that can be used to analyze even different changes that take place right now, because there is not that much information in Ukraine which is open and that we can use, but the number of dissertations submitted or R&D reports submitted, this is something that we can trace. And UkrNT provides, this National Repository of Academic Texts provides very explicit information about that. And it's easy to work with that database. So we use it for our research a lot. And here, this is just a general heartbeat of the system over the years from 1991 till basically present. The last data for this specific presentation, I think it was something like August 2023, 22, something. I must double check, but I think it's yeah, we did this, whatever. It's very, very close, and we can go as, yeah, it's August 23. So we can go as close as we like in this research. And what is important here is that we can see that how the total number of documents has been changing over years and how it has dropped when the war has started. And of course, when if we go back to the definition of this, the like very schematic definition of resilience, we talk about bouncing forward. So technically, we're talking about the moment when the system will be producing as many documents as it has been producing before the war. So at least at the same level or higher. This is what we're aiming. And the shorter the period is, the more resilient the system is. Or then we qualify like the level of resilience in terms of time means this. But at the moment, this is the phenomena that we're looking at. And if we look into more details, then so just once again, so I just unfold this specific part of the graph, and this is what we see, right? So again, from it is for a bit more than 2 years. So from January 21, just to show the last heartbeat, and then when the war starts, so the shock on the scientific output, which is the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And during this time when the system basically was down in terms of number of documents that have been submitted, we talk about key events such as civilian evacuation, territory occupation, deoccupation, intense electricity bombardments, infrastructure bombardments, and so on and so on. And the key problem here is that there are many events, but we don't know what were the researchers experiencing at that time. And because every document submitted is the researcher which is behind it. So for us, it was essential and important to understand what is the motivation for every researcher to continue working. And we were interested in actually seeing answers from different regions across Ukraine. And just to understand the temperature of answers for those who are in the west of Ukraine, for example, or those who are in the occupied or deoccupied territories, or from those universities who have been relocated for the first time in the year 22, or for those who have been relocated for the second time, because we also had the universities that have been relocated in 2014. And then they had to relocate again because their first relocation wasn't really successful because they didn't relocate really far from the occupied territories. So there was a relocation to Severodonetsk, for example, which was not successful as we see right now because they had to relocate again. And then we had, for example, Berdyansk with their university, and they ended up being in occupation. Or at the same time, we have researchers from the west of Ukraine, which basically mention, well, we don't really experience the war, right? Because they are really, really far. So the problems for the researchers and for the administration of the universities and R&D institutions is very different across different oblasts or regions in English. And so what we did at that time, so it was around, again, it was around August 23. So we classified the oblasts using the information from alerts in UA. This is the website where we get all the notifications from and all the information about the number of explosions, air raid sirens, and their duration, and also the number of artillery attacks. And we classified the regions. We grouped them into, basically, as you see on this graph, in this bar chart, sorry, into 3 groups. And basically less than 1,000 explosions over this period of time for the first 8 months, right, or 6 months of the war, then between 1 and 2,000 and over 2,000. And also we have 2 areas that have no data for obvious reasons. Crimea, we don't have access to them for right now for about 10 years, for more than 10 years already. And in Luhansk area, first of all, there are just a few researchers that are left there. And for the second reason is that we didn't get enough. Oops, I'm really sorry. 1 second. Is it my phone? I'm really sorry. I hope it's not very, I really apologize.
No worries, no worries, no.
Yes, it shouldn't have happened. It's just, but in any case, so we have grouped this, and it actually, if we go further and see it on the map, so I will try to explain this here. So first, from the graph before, you see like the most affected territories obviously are those which are bordering the occupied territories, and this is where the most of the well, economically speaking, treatment happening, but at the same time, this is where we have the most of the bombardments, because this is basically where the war is actively taking place, and the most of the bombardment is there. And then we see the second part of the territories, which is where we have less and the least affected territories. Then when we talk about the numbers that we see here, this is the number of researchers per region. So here, for example, it will be for Kiev and for Oblast. And then we would see here like also the numbers that here we don't have any information, but here is just a few researchers, as I've mentioned before. And this is what we have for the front line at the beginning of the war. What is important to have as a disclaimer here, this is the number of researchers for the year 2020, because for now we don't have accurate information on the number of researchers, just because we have data that is not open publicly from one side, and from the other side is the issue with the reporting in Ukraine that we have, and to have information accurately on where the researchers are physically located, whether they have been relocated, whether they are in Ukraine or abroad. At that point in time, it was not possible to access that information. So we just have it as it is. Right now, there is a bit more evidence on the number of researchers who are abroad. So, for example, the Presidium of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine would definitely provide this information, but it's, again, usually it's a subject to limited access for the security reasons. And but in general, we talk about around 80,000 researchers that we had in 2020. And here below, you can see where we got our respondents from. So we tried to have someone from Kiev and Kiev Oblast because it was first, it was occupied, and second, it's a larger group that is residing in this area. Then we tried to have someone from the very area which is surrounded by the mountains, which will probably will never be invaded, and people there are very relaxed. And then, of course, someone from the deoccupied territories, and also from the coastal parts, because here we don't have much access. There were just a few people here, and also from Odessa. And then talking about the communication with these researchers, so we spoke to them within our Science at Risk project, and we did it last year, so less than a year ago. It was during the summertime, and the answers were very interesting. I have a number of snapshots just to cover some of the answers, and just to show like some outstanding answers that might just sparkle thinking in this direction. So the first one and the key was researchers mentioning that the evacuation plans for the scenario of war were outdated, and they were from the Second World War times. So it might sound like it's something not problematic, but then the problem is that the enemy was from the other side. So all the evacuation points, including for the equipment, for the research equipment, were towards Russia. So when the war started, there was a critical problem with not understanding where to go to, because as a state institution, R&D institutes or universities, they have to follow the instructions that are signed by whatever authority. And in many cases, those locations were towards Kharkiv, or they were towards north of Ukraine, for example. And that was a serious issue, and it remained so for quite some time at the beginning of the war. And I think it is still a problem, because to relocate the equipment, it was not possible to relocate every single team, for example, every single set of equipment. That was a huge shock for the system at that time. And from the other side, there was this personal perspective. So some of the researchers from the west from the from the side with the mountains, they were mentioning that first of all, they didn't accept anyone officially from the relocated institutes, and there were no programs like that. So there was, even though we had partly our territories were partly occupied in 2014. There was not enough thinking process happening in understanding how can we relocate our researchers in case it happens again. So there was no lesson learned on the large scale, and this resulted in researchers taking up to 3 months, 4 months, half a year to actually find their new way and understand how they can keep working. And because when the researcher is moving from one institution to another, usually it's a very smooth transition. There is no network that is lost, and it's very planned, and it takes around a year to actually relocate somewhere. But when it's because of the war, it's a bit different setting. So the entire network is lost, social network. The researcher ends up being in a new environment. They have to organize everything around them, including finding a job, including relocating their children and understanding where these children need to go to, coping with the trauma because they have been bombarded, like myself when I was evacuating from Kiev. And all of this needs to be reorganized over a short period of time, because some researchers do have savings, but in general, researchers in Ukraine don't get enough salary. And it was a huge shock. And from our observation, we see that for those researchers that have been internally displaced or have been displaced outside of Ukraine, it took them a while to figure out their personal life and to feel secure to keep working. Of course, there were some outstanding examples where researchers would continue working as much as possible. And there are some examples where one researcher, she submitted like 14 papers in a year. But this is just an extreme example. But we also have researchers who say that I'm a female, with 2 children, ended up in Czech Republic, not knowing the language, have never thought I will go to Czech Republic to work or live there, and having no understanding how to live there and having no funds for that. And this is a huge problem because from one side, everyone says there is a lot of support. Of course, she might have salary like scholarship, for example, but having 2 kids at the back and thinking, oh, I have salary for 6 months and I cannot go back home. Well, it does help for a short period of time, but it doesn't solve the problem. So it's very stressful. And many female researchers were mentioning that in many cases, they had to stop working as researchers because of this. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, because with them leaving academia because of these very objective problems, they actually take out all the expertise that is not published, that is not discussed at the conferences, no network is being developed, and so on. So it's a huge damage in the end. And then we also talk about well, I said a bit about this unit mobility a little bit, but also there was this quote: "No, we didn't relocate any labs to our university. Mainly, there was no request." So from the other side, there was such a huge shock that figuring out how to relocate that, it was not an easy task itself. And this is what we were trying to dig deeper into in our other research, but for the sake of time, I will not really focus on this, because what the researchers were doing, for example, they would try to run their experiments using the servers, for example, in CERN or in other centers around Europe, for example. But again, if we talk about geographical dimension, then we talk that there was a lot of collaboration since the beginning of the war of Ukraine and European countries, especially with Poland and Germany. But at the same time, the number of collaborations with the North America and within the United States especially, this number has decreased. And if we talk about the specific citation, it's from Ina Ganguly and Fabian Waldinger from their recent paper on the war in Ukraine. And they were mentioning that the number of collaborations has decreased for the North America, while in Europe it has increased. And what we understand, given a bit of a context to this, is that in Europe, for example, in my case or in case with my colleagues, it was just, I wrote an email and I was accepted within hours. And it was, yeah, you just can come, we'll figure out everything as we go. And in the United States, it was a bit opposite. I think it's just because of the planning procedures and everything. And this was, we have to go through whatever process, and it takes like 6 months. Or for example, I wanted to apply for a scholarship in Australia. It was possible to go there. Everything was nice and smooth. But then in the end, the comment was that, yeah, but you need to go through the entire process of application, but I don't have the time. Because for me personally, I don't have where to live. I basically came with my backpack, having everything, leaving everything behind. And I'm not in a situation when I have funds, resources, and whatever else to spend a year on possibly getting somewhere. And these were like the key restrictions that many researchers experienced in case with the North America, even though there is a huge amount of support, of course, but it was more like lagged in time. And this was not what researchers were requiring when everyone was coming, basically, as I said before, with a backpack. So there was no match between demand and supply. And this is what we're trying to put, to have more attention to, because there were many discussions, how to formulate this, when we were suggested what we need, but it was not what we needed. And we're trying to verbalize and articulate, like, this is what the fleeing process is like, and this is what stages we go through, and this is what kind of support we need, because it doesn't really help if we get well, of course it does help, but if this support is not what is urgently needed here at this point in time, this is not what will help us to solve the problem that we have right now. And of course, right now, when we are 3 years into war, over 2 years into the war, in the third year, of course, everyone had time to apply for these positions that take longer to get to, or their first contract is over and everyone already understands where they want to go. But at the beginning, it was crucial and important to actually listen to what problems we had on the ground. So then we had another part of comments, also very interesting. So Ukraine is known, of course, to be a post-Soviet country, and I'm sure all of you know that we are in a constant process of transitioning from the post-Soviet model, very centralized, with one key person in power, very hierarchical, towards more Western system where the employee is important, where everything has everyone has the right to say, and where it's all debate and discussion. I'm not saying it's in every team is like that, but the difference in these two worlds, it's apparent. So for Ukrainian scientific system in general, it would be more this hierarchical system and more vertical communication. And during the war, when the war has started, it has become increasingly horizontal. So it was possible to write the message to anyone and to get the answer, because everyone was so united and everyone was trying to, well, everyone, the majority, were trying to solve the problems on the go, because everyone understood that we have to save the teams. So, for example, there was evidence from Berdyansk University. They were saying that they would gather with their students somewhere in the park because they didn't have the facilities where they would lecture or where they would organize something. They would provide food to their students. They would just act based on what were the immediate needs. And there was no importance whether this person is a rector of the university or is an associate professor or administrative staff. It didn't matter. The most important was to save people and to ensure that everyone's fed and not cold and basically in a safe place. So this was something interesting just to extract from these interviews that we're working on. And very interesting part, which was not apparent, but as we live in a digital world, it became very, very essential, is actually understanding whether the organization is digital or non-digital. What I mean by this, so we had two very distinctive examples. So we have one of the institutes for nuclear studies at the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And they, because of the security protocols, they never had any information left in the institute. It was always somewhere, but not at the institute. And they would never send it in a specific, in a general way. It would be a very specific protocol how they would do that. So when the north of Ukraine, so over Kiev, was occupied, the entire institute was demolished. Like, I mean, the walls are there, but they were, all the windows were destroyed. Everything that was inside was ripped off, stolen. If it was not ripped off or stolen, it was shot. So if there was some servers or computers that were the occupying forces were not able to take away, they would just shot at them. So it's not possible. So it was not possible to use them afterwards. So this institute has lost like everything they had there, like mostly everything. But at the same time, they didn't lose the key part, which is information, because they were digital enough. At the same time, we have this example from Berdyansk, which was occupied at the beginning of the war. And they mentioned the opposite. They had a very weak website. They had not enough, so their server has not been backed up, for example. And so in the end, they lost everything with no chance of actually restoring that. So, but again, they were lucky just to leave that territory, because the stories they were sharing are just the worst nightmare of the war that can be experienced by one. But they were very lucky that they were able to survive. And so these are just examples that are essential and important to mention, because we talk about resilience, right? So digitalization of the processes is actually something that ensures that we can keep going, and it will take us less time to get back to normal if we don't lose the information. So these two examples, they were very, very bold in terms of how both institutions have lost everything, but one keeps going almost immediately, and the second one, it took them quite some time to get back to normal. And what I mentioned before is that about our needs, and that we function differently. This is just one of the codes that is below here. So the system in Ukraine functions differently. I mean, the scientific system, and to a certain extent, it's very unique because it's not Soviet anymore, and it's not Western yet. And wherever it is in the space, even in Ukraine, not always we understand what happens. So when it comes to like what kind of support you need, and we understand like we cannot really answer that, because obviously like funding, obviously like leadership, obviously like collaborations, whatever. But then to what extent, in what shape and form, then it comes to different levels of analysis. So for example, at the institute level, or geographically, whether it's in Kharkiv, where it makes more sense to build bunkers, while, for example, in the west of Ukraine, it makes more sense to build roads or tunnels to actually relocate to the safer place. So this is something that needs to be kept in mind. So more expertise from Ukraine when it comes to the support is very, very essential. And when someone tries to measure what happens in Ukraine in terms of scientific output, for example, it is also very different from the West. In the West, our colleagues usually use, for example, if we talk about science of science or economics of science, it's often that Scopus is taken as the key source of information. But Ukrainians here are know that Scopus is not everything we have. From the first slides, we had example that we also have Ukr.NTI, and they have tons of dissertations and R&D reports. And not everything we do in R&D report for our R&D topics gets published in Scopus, while we invest a lot of time into that. So this is some specifics. And so when someone tries to measure us, we're like, well, it's not exactly how it needs to be done. And maybe to give a bit more precise answer to this question, a bit more expertise from Ukrainian side will be required. And also, okay, I have maybe 2 more slides. And also there is a question about the preparedness. So I took this Berdyansk example here because I think they're outstanding. In the way they keep going is just an exceptional example, but also from a bit of a different perspective. So we spoke with them about this preparedness. So resilience is also about like, how do you anticipate what will happen? How do you get ready for that? And it doesn't matter. It can be the war, it can be earthquakes, it can be wildfires. It doesn't matter. It's just understanding of what kind of scenario can happen. And they live in not far from Crimea, understanding what kind of temperature is in that region, with attempts to occupy some of those territories in 2014 from Russian Federation. They still noted they lived in the bubble that there is nothing going to be happening. And they said for them it was quite a surprise that actually there was an invasion, and they didn't really believe at the beginning, which was an interesting point. So there must be something that was happening that made them feel safe. Then there is also this readiness for a specific scenario. There was a very interesting comment from them. They said that they ended up being in this occupied on this occupied territory in this university, and they had to hide there. And they wanted to save the information from their servers, but they wouldn't dare to switch on the internet and electricity. So the occupying forces, which were located 50 meters or 100 meters away from the university, some in the port. So they wouldn't go online. So the occupying forces don't see them online, don't see the network, and don't come and don't kill them. So because of this, obviously they made it right. They didn't switch on the servers. They've lost the information. But going back to this digital part, they could have saved the information. So they didn't have this decision going on in their heads, like, how do we save the information and stay alive at the same time? So this was about this preparedness, which comes back to the first comment, that they didn't really expect that the war can happen. And this is like, we were notified from October on, from November on, we were like, there might be the war, and it was intensifying with the time progressing. But at the same time, even in the close proximity from Crimea and from, well, they're on the Azov side of Ukraine, they didn't really feel the threat. And then there was another comment that it was more like on academic propaganda. And it was also from Berdyansk. And why it is interesting, because they are from this close proximity to the occupied territories. And why it is important? Because there are two things. The first is, which is away from what we're talking right now, is broadcasting. So if the radio is accessible, if the TV channels are accessible, if the networks are somehow infiltrating, I mean, the researchers and whoever's neighbors traveling, commuting to Crimea and back and so on, it's very easy to impose some thoughts. And the researchers from this institute, they were mentioning that in their minds, they were constantly dealing with the understanding that there is no research in the domain of social sciences in Ukraine, and they won't be able to publish in Scopus. They purely believed in that. But then the respondent, she mentioned, but then I was so surprised when I checked Scopus, when she says it's a quote, when I checked Scopus and see that there is tons of Russian articles full of anti-Ukrainian propaganda there. So it was from both sides. So they didn't really believe that there is social sciences in Ukraine. And from the other side, they were mentioning that what they saw is that it was more like this confirmation that there is no social sciences in Ukraine, but in academic manner. So it was an interesting observation what we found. And then there was another comment on security and personnel retention and information leaks. So here it is important to mention that there was a lot of very difficult decisions that researchers were making. And they said that sometimes they would opt for collaborating because it would save their lives. And this is what everyone was in the not occupied, controlled by Ukraine territories. This is what was actively supported, that if a researcher ends up in the occupied territory, they have to save their life. And there was one of the comments that people do disappear, especially if they don't collaborate, and it's common, and it's one of the instruments that is used against us. And from their personal experience, from these respondents, they were mentioning that they were threatened that their children will be sent to Ural, or that they will never see them again. And sadly, we know that it does happen. And there were suggestions for the employees to collaborate. And there are sometimes, well, not sometimes, it's quite often, that you don't get the medical support if you don't get the passport, or you don't get employed, or you don't get insurance if you don't get passport, and so on. And there's, in many cases, there are not that many options to choose from, because sometimes it's elderly who cannot leave, or people are just threatened enough not to leave, and so on and so on. So there were various very interesting comments just from this interview evidence from people who were there physically and who had to flee and were successful in their fleeing. And basically, this is it. I think that I'm relatively on time. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to answer. And I'll also leave my contacts here. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm just Anastasiia Lutsenko. And yeah, this is my email address that can be used for any contact. And yes, I think that's it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anastasiia. This was remarkable and extremely moving. As everyone can see and say, I open the time for questions and comments now, please. I see the hand from Dr. Deutsch. Dr. Leonard Deutsch is our former Dean of Graduate Studies in Marshall University. Please, Leonard.
Okay, your relocation, as you described it, was relatively smooth. Is that because you're as fluent in German as you are in English?
I had like 10 words in German. I was fortunate enough to relocate to Munich, which I barely hear German language here. But if it was the university where, like German university 10 years ago, I wouldn't be able to blend as fast as it was right now. So I would say this is not as an example of how it happens. Right now I'm learning German, of course, but it was just, this specific institute is very English oriented. I think because of it's in economics. So, but like, it's just speculations.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I have question also. Thank you very much for very interesting and profound research. And my question, what I actually know that as a result of the war, 1/3 of scientific facilities in Ukraine was destroyed, and scholars had to relocate to other countries. And of course, it's obvious that brain drain and reduction of financial support contributed to this crisis. And my question is how EU and America can help or can support Ukrainian scientific institution, and also how they can support scholars to continue their research. And I just have one actually parallel that it might not be very actually good, but I remember after the collapse of Soviet Union, their scholars were among first victims. They had no support, they were not needed, and their job was not appreciated at all. So, and it was tremendous moral damage. We were useless members of society. We brought nothing. And in this situation, I remember how the MacArthur Foundation, located in Moscow at this time, specifically supported scholars across all post-Soviet republics. And it was extremely important for me. I got grant, and my colleagues got grant as well. So that was an example how external donors may help in such situation. So that my question again, how EU and America can help to resolve this situation today and in the near and midterm development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a very crucial question, and we have this question in our minds all the time. And I think it's two-folded. So the first part is the researchers who are outside of Ukraine with a lot of opportunities for the mobility, and it's not a problem as researchers are residing, for example, in Germany, they can work in Germany. So it's more on the side of researchers, whether they're interested in that. There are many opportunities like Science for Ukraine or this Maria Skłodowska career actions. There are many options where researchers can continue. There is a bit of requirement from Ukrainian side, so there must be Ukrainian affiliation unless researchers are willing to go down the general track, so with no affiliation to Ukraine. So then they will go through the general competition. It's harder, but maybe some researchers are opting that way. But there are options for researchers affiliated in Ukraine to find the positions through the specific initiatives and tracks for Ukraine. Why I'm saying this, because answering your question, there is, well, it's never enough, but there is substantial support for the researchers from one side, but there is a serious problem in Ukraine. We have a lot of male researchers or female researchers who are not leaving their husbands or their parents or their children. And those, they need support. They have to have those, for instance, remote positions, right? This is one of those comments that we often hear, that maybe remote positions, remote affiliations are very important, but then we bump into the problem. There can be short-term grants, but the first researchers require some funding to work on their research is the first thing. It's not a short term, and then they have to run again when there is no electricity. It's being bombed all the time, but they have to have at least some stability for their research activities. But then they cannot work from Ukraine for any institution outside of Ukraine because they have to pay taxes where they live. And this is the problem with the European Union, and this is the problem for the states, because they cannot work as a full-time employee for the institution if they are not in the European Union or in the country where they work for the university. So the key problem here is, like, if the war happens in the territory which is outside of the European Union, it doesn't really matter how much we want to help, but on the individual level, it bumps into these taxation problems. And this is what we experience, and this is where it would be very helpful if there was, not just for Ukraine, but just a special track for the scholars at risk for this taxation thing. This would be something to look at, because we have been discussing with colleagues a lot that it would be helpful to have those remote positions. But they say, well, it can be a short-term grant, but they cannot be employed. So this, I would say, one of the key problems, because the rest are like Fulbright scholarships, I don't know, international collaborations, consortiums. There are so many instruments. But what we have is female researchers outside of Ukraine with 2 children who have scholarship, which is enough for 1 person, but not enough for 3 people, including 2 kids. And then we have another problem is thousands of male researchers in Ukraine, and for them, either a digital affiliation or whatever, as soon as it bumps into paying money and pay stubs, this is where we have the problem. So I would address this specific issue and try to help in this specific point, because there is a great interest to work. It's definitely 75% of our researchers, based on our research, they say over 2 years, so 3 surveys, 75% of researchers are willing to work for free, just to work.
Do you know any cases of their successful help, successful outside help for science for the researchers and professors, say after their was in Yugoslavia, for former Yugoslavia, or other places, say in North Ireland or other, maybe somewhere in the Middle East, how typically donors may help their scholars and professors. Do you know any patterns of this help?
Yes, actually have to say that not really. Not really. We were studying this in general because we were so consumed with the Ukrainian case that was rather isolated. And what we've experienced is that there are not that many examples that we can say it's very similar to Ukraine. And we were generally reviewing, okay, this is what was happening in the Middle East. This is how researchers relocated to the European Union, for example. It's barely the same, especially if it's 24th paragraph, is the same like it was happening in Balkan during the Balkan crisis, for example, because they also had the 24th paragraph. So in the European Union, it's not a problem. It's fairly the same. I'm not sure if it's the same for the United States. I'm not as experienced in this specific field part of the question, but I think it's definitely an interesting topic to look at and to see maybe apart from this paragraph that we are all enrolled to right now, maybe this is definitely something to look and see, like how it has been happening in case with Syria, for example, or again with Yugoslavia. But again, I think it was largely solved through this specific paragraph, which used for the exceptional cases.
I know the foundation that specifically help journalists at risk, or doctors help certain groups of population. There might be certain patterns of support to scholars and professors.
Even those who are in this territory, who are encapsulated and cannot leave, right? Yeah, okay. Maybe we should look into that as well, because we were more like on this needs part, and then maybe we should definitely have a separate research on understanding, because of course there is this Scholars at Risk or CARA or different other initiatives like Maria Sklodowska-Curie, but usually they say like we can help those who are outside, but then definitely, yeah. Thank you so much for this comment.
And I also believe that in the future, certain private foundations like MacArthur Foundation and other more independent foundations, they may create a grant program specifically for Ukraine if there's actually request from Ukraine. That was my actually thought. Thank you.
Yes, actually, when you say this, of course, there are many small programs. For example, it was possible for the researchers in Ukraine to apply for micro grants, and they would get like, I don't know, $20,000 for 10 employees to pay at least 100 euros per year or per month, which adds on to their salary. For example, there are some micro events like this, but on the state level, I wouldn't say it's what I mean by the state level. For example, the pension right now in Ukraine, the pension is paid from the programs funded by the European Union. So for example, I'm a person with disabilities and my pension comes from the taxpayers in the EU. So there is no such program for the researchers or for scientists, but there is such program for the civil society. And maybe I mean, there are many small programs, as I mentioned before, but maybe if it was on this level with like general understanding, like we don't need to have a buffer zone. We don't have to have this gray zone, which used to be Ukraine. We need to have a high-tech territory with this Iron Dome, which can protect the eastern border of the European countries. We have to go in that direction. So then there would be this specific part of funds that goes into science. If that was happening, that would be like of great help, not only to us, because if we end up having no science, well, it's a bad sign. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Anara, you're muted.
I think the case of Ukraine actually can demonstrate a new opportunities for scholars, because donors clearly overlook this moment that they should support not only women, children, vulnerable groups of population, but also scholars and researchers. Especially what happened during the World War, during the Russia's war in Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the comment.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much. There are so many questions. Katerina, please.
I apologize if this is not a good question, but I'm wondering if support and productivity, if it varies by academic discipline. Like, for example, is there more support for scholars or researchers in chemistry, biology, the hard sciences, than there is in economics, than there is in the social sciences, literature? Does it vary by discipline? Or does all the help that is offered, is it just blanket for any kind of research?
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question. And I have to confess that it's with the samples that we have, it's not very easy to go and see the patterns, because knowing how many disciplines we have by classification, over 2,000 researchers, it ends up being 2-3 people, or at least like 20 people in the sample. And it's not something that we can say, well, these are definitely receiving enough support and these are not. So we cannot use this sample to say that it's credible enough. But I think the research on this analysis of the programs, and just to see maybe web scrape and see like what are the scholarships, where do they go to, this possibly would be something to look at. I don't want to really speculate on that, but what we can use as a proxy, for example, the Science for Ukraine initiative, and they have over 1,000, I think even more, maybe even more opportunities for Ukrainian researchers, and at least to see from there, what do they offer more? That would be at least a starting point to understand how much individual support happens, because it was just not the focus of my research for now, so I cannot really, but I'm sure it's very, very important question, of course.
So to switch gears, you're in Munich. Munich has the Ukrainian Free University, UVU, Ukrainski Universitet. And that's the only Ukrainian university I know outside of Ukraine. And I don't know if there's more, but are institutions like that reaching out to welcome scholars, to help scholars? Is UVU doing anything?
Yes. They do. Even in my surrounding, I have someone who has applied and has started studying with them, and they support. They are very active. They provide events. They raise awareness. So they are active in their activities. I'm not sure to what extent, but I know that they are on the radar, and I know that it was popular among those who came to actually look for education, and they provide this unique opportunity in Munich to study in Ukrainian, which is for those who, as I said during the presentations, for those who came not knowing the language, it was what do you call it? The safe thing. When you swim,
a haven. It's a flotation device, a safety.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I came with the fluent English, so for me it was not a problem. But there are many people who came who never spoke any international at any international events before. So for them, of course, it was very, very challenging, which is of course hard.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I want to thank you on your very helpful graphics, and you, with such clarity and elegance, you presented such complicated materials and educated all of us. I was genuinely impressed with what you were able to share with us, and I imagine how much time that must have taken to put together. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm very happy that there is interest. And when we spoke with Victor, it was clear that there is interest, because for us who study science of science, it's such a small thing that we do. It's like, oh, is it even interesting for anyone? And then, yeah, there is a broad audience who wants to listen about that. And for me, it's a compliment. And thank you so much for inviting. It's very, very important for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anastasiia. I think we might have time for one more question if people have. We have good representation today, mostly from United States, but we constantly also get researchers from Kiev, our friends from Kharkiv sometimes. If we have no more questions, I do not see any hands. Let me thank Anastasiia from the bottom of my heart for taking time to speak with us. It's clear that what they are doing is absolutely unique, and we hope science like this will not be needed in the future, but we cannot be sure. This is remarkable, what you all of you are doing, and we wish you well, and we want to stay in touch, and definitely please share this recording to anyone who cares to see and listen. Dr. Shrey, please say a couple of words in Ukrainian to our viewers, as we usually do.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Дуже дякую. Спасибо
Дуже
большое.
Дякую.
Thank you.